We've got a really busy September, so we're not really going to get out any of our planned strategy review videos this month. But a couple of us went down to Protospiel Chicago last weekend. It's a board game design convention. I've been a bit of a budding designer for a couple of years now. Had a few ideas that I've worked on, especially through these conventions. They've been very helpful for getting feedback, and I think it's an interesting time to peel back some of your assumptions about games and actually look at them at a bit of a deeper level. So I find them pretty entertaining. Jen went with me.
Hi, I'm Jen. So yeah, we've been to the Protospiels in Madison and Milwaukee, and this was the inaugural event in Chicago. And I actually, let me know if you agree with me, I actually think it was a little bit larger than the Madison and Milwaukee events.
I would kind of expect so, given the relative population of the area, but it was the first year for Chicago, but the Protospiel quote-unquote brand is kind of the Midwest game design convention, and they started, I think, in either Ann Arbor or Western Michigan, and then spread across Lake Michigan, and I think they even have one up in the Twin Cities now. But so you see a lot of the same people hopping from event to event when you got 3 or 4 of them a year. So even though it was inaugural, because there was already this built-in community, there were a lot of people attending from previous Protospiels. But even so, given the larger area, I do think I would agree it was maybe slightly bigger than the other two, or certainly on the same scale, which is good for a first year event.
I actually think because it was in a more major city, that it actually drew a lot more people outside the Midwest, because I know I met someone from Colorado, and I think there was someone from Toronto, so it's
the Toronto
couple of new faces.
The Toronto people were at Milwaukee too,
Oh,
weren't they?
were they?
I might have played one of their card games in Milwaukee.
But the other big thing is I thought this event specifically had a higher ratio of testers to games, because at the other event it seems like there was always a dearth of testers. But in this one, at least on 2 or 3 occasions, I saw testers with nothing to do because there weren't enough games, which is a good thing. I think having too many testers is better than having, not enough.
So if you've never been to one of these things, a one-day badge for a designer is like $25, or it's $50 for the weekend, but a playtester gets in for the entire weekend for $10. Because as designers, we need the services of playtesters, and you're expected as a designer to go test other people's games, which both helps them and you, and you're supposed to give one play for each player you require. So if I have a 4-player game, I should test it once and go play 3 other games. But having dedicated testers around is very helpful. And even if you're not into designing games, if you have one of these and you really want to see how the sausage is made, I think it's a good time if you're willing to learn a few things and if you're willing to give constructive feedback.
To me, I just went as a tester because I'm in no way a game designer. And to me, the board gaming community has given a lot to me. And testing at these events is sort of my way of giving back and making sure that the community stays around and thrives.
So since we didn't get to play all the same games, I'm going to have us each talk in alternation about the games we did play. And then we'll get to the end when we actually played a couple of games together. But we'll talk in alternation about the games that we did play, describe the rules a bit, talk about what we liked, what we didn't, ask a few questions, and kind of give you a feel for what a Protospiel is like.
So the first game I played was the Egg Merchants of Drag by Rattlebox Games, and it was a worker placement, but not really, but role selection sort of Euro-style game about, and it had an economic element because you're trying to collect and then sell dragon eggs to the, highest bidder. And it was actually really cool. The theme was very well integrated, and it was actually a lot of fun. And I think the one thing that was really unique about it is it had this really different role selection mechanic where the role you select, so like a Race for the Galaxy, if everyone selects the same role, it still does the same thing. And this, if multiple people select the same role, it has different effects, which might be better or worse depending on exactly which card you select. And I thought that was really neat. It was definitely still rough around the edges edges, and a lot of those rule selection cards needed some balancing because there's some of them that were just way too powerful and a couple of game breakers. But the fact that the roles sort of changed depending on how many people played them sort of made you have a press your luck or a risk management or even just a poker style reading what the other player is going to do mechanic, and I really like that, and I really hope they continue to develop it because I think there's a really great game in there once they smooth out some of the issues.
That mechanic sounds a bit to me like either Glass Road or Western Town, although those two have a similar thing where you can play off someone else's card to basically half nullify it on them.
It was a little bit different than that. I mean, I don't want to explain it exactly because it's still in development, but it's similar to that, but it had a really unique spin on it.
And I'm not super surprised that it sounds like the powers, they weren't quite nailed down yet. That's always the hardest thing to do. You kind of got to prove the mechanics before you actually get into balancing those powers.
And so what was your first game?
Okay, my first game was After the Fall by Dusty Oakley. It's an interesting combination of theme and mechanics because it's a post-apocalyptic game, but it was a post-apocalyptic game, more about survival than, let's say, combat, and it was resource management, so it was actually somewhat Euro-esque for a post-apocalyptic game. So that was interesting, and basically the idea was to scavenge enough resources to survive as many of your people as long as you can throughout the game. We talk a little bit more about the mechanics, but you basically started with a number of workers, and you could send them out to explore these junkyards, which turn cards face up, and then you could bring them home, but they would take a certain number of people to bring them home. Or there was some basic resources you could collect, or you could collect plans that you would then be able to use to build things, but you have to dedicate a lot of labor to them. So the big thing that I ended up feeling in that game was that the costs of doing everything was super high. He had just completely redone all the numbers. He wanted to open up the design space by doubling all the numbers, basically. So he had just done that, and that certainly didn't work as it was, but I don't know that it was working better before, just from my feel of it. You needed 2 food and 2 water per person, and you had 5 people, so you needed to collect 10 and 10 of each out of 5 actions, and depending on what cards came up, you might not see water at all. There was a concept of dirty water that you could get some credit for, but not all, but basically, if you took the basic actions, you might be able to get your 5 workers to get 10 of those 20 resources, and if you got lucky and stuff came up, you could do better. But you were always behind, and in a game like that, you kind of gotta be always behind, but if you're that far behind, you don't have any tension to it. I want to compare it to In the Year of the Dragon, where you know you're going to lose some people, but
you can plan ahead.
But you can plan ahead, and one of the things in this is all those resource cards are face down, so you didn't know it was coming till you went out and looked, and if you didn't like it, you didn't waste your worker, you might be able to apply them to something else later, but it wasn't great. You're not going to lose everything, and sometimes you actually do survive the whole thing. For me, psychologically, I want to have a shot at surviving the whole thing. So I'd rather see it be razor's edge rather than me missing 10 things every time, but 20 being the threshold where I actually have a guy die. I'd much rather have it be like a razor's edge where if I get it, I'm okay, and if I miss it by 1, the guy's halfway to death, but that I have a shot of ending up on either end.
Yeah, that's why these designers are doing these events, is to try to figure out those balances. You
don't see a lot of those disaster management games where stuff is going wrong and you can't really win. You just have to
survive long
You
enough.
have to lose less than everyone else.
Yeah, that's kind of almost tragically realistic, too.
And it ended up being like such a point where I was scavenging for resources so hard that I didn't really want to build any blueprints, and there were just some other things where the intended ramp up, I just don't think it was there yet. But I did like the fact that we had another game where you were expected to fall behind a little bit. Mm-hmm. So that was interesting.
The next game I played was called Prairie, and it was by Randy Ickel. And this was interesting because it was kind of half worker placement and half route building, like traveling around a board collecting things. What was really interesting about it is there were basically every round you had 3 cards, and 1 let you do the worker placement portions, 1 let you do the moving around the board collecting resources portion, and the other one let you do one or the other. And then you would pick which one you wanted to do. You would order those 3 cards. So if you're like, well, I want to move right away because someone else is going to take this spot I need, or I want to place this worker right now, you pick one of your cards. And the way he did this 3-card deck was just really well balanced and made sense, and it was just really elegant. And the game itself was fun, but it definitely had some resource issues. There was not enough resources to collect in order to do anything meaningful by the end of the game. But we offered some ideas to where you could fix that. We think the movement on the movement portion of the board was costing too many movement points, which wasn't allowing us to get enough resources. We were thinking the buildings he had you could build could give out more resources too. There was definitely the seeds of a great game in there, but it was still really, really rough. Much like the other game, I really hope to see it come to fruition because there's a lot of good ideas, even though they aren't really hammered out yet.
My second game, I don't remember the name of the designer, and I don't actually know if the game had a name yet, but
if you're the designer, let us know. We'll put it in the description.
I want to say it was Andrew something. His name was in all lowercase, and he was complaining about it. It was a bag-building combat game with a dexterity element. So you had 5 classes of pieces, and they were assigned to poker chips, and you started with a number of them. And you drew the chips out, and the chips correspond to these 5 cards with the classes that tell you how much money they're worth if you choose to use them to build your bag. But they also had attack, defense, and I'll get to the combat in a minute, but if you spent money on them, you would acquire a card from the center tableau, and then that would actually cover up the card on your board, so all your pieces of that class are suddenly different.
That sounds interesting.
Then going with that, you could instead take one of the chips plus 2 of them from the peasant class, so you could put up to 3 chips on the board. And the board is how you got victory points, and you had to dexterity flip them in, so they had to revolve in the air, and flip them into the board near these 4 castles. And if you had more pieces within 1 unit of the castle, at the end of your turn you'd score a point per castle, and you were racing to 20. So you could flip out 1 good piece and 2 weak pieces onto the board every turn, or you could spend them for money to upgrade your things. So when we first played, he had measuring sticks, and you actually had to measure your distances. I think I glazed over a couple of other things I wanted to mention. So you flip them onto the board, but then people were complaining before about being stuck where you landed. So he added the ability to anything that land got 1 action, which was either move it 1 unit based on these rulers, or attack something that was within 1 unit. And then the attacks were just straight up compare attack to defense, and it's all in one go. And if your attack is higher, the other one's removed from the board. Pretty basic on that front. Okay, so the other thing was that some of the pieces had what he was calling command, and if you flip those in, they could cause other pieces to move again. The dexterity element was actually rather mild. You flip them in once, but after that you have time to move them around. Given that, it ended up being by far the crunchiest dexterity game I'm aware of.
Yeah, that was a long explanation for a dexterity game.
I don't want to call it a dexterity game. It's a bag-building combat game with a dexterity element. Because the dexterity is kind of the smallest element of the thing.
Which is if nothing else, is unique.
Yep. The 2 big things that I had to give him on that one was, A, his map had a grid on it, and we suggested, let's try snapping to the grid. And as soon as we did that, the walking around trying to measure with the ruler and thinking about movement, that all just went away. It sped the gameplay up 50%. So I don't know if he'll keep it, because it might be a little less tactical without that, but it certainly caused the game to chug along a lot faster. The second thing was, every one of these cards you acquired, there were like 10 unique magic-style powers, which I just said, these are just cruft. Even though there's only 10 and I could eventually learn them, I think it just overcomplicates the games. Powers are a difficult thing. I've experienced this in my own designs. When you're designing them, it's like, wow, these sound really awesome. Let the player do a lot of really cool rule-breaking things. And it feels like it's going to be so much fun, and you get in the game, and it's like, I can do these 10 things, and I can't remember what I'm allowed to do. It's a really easy place to just completely overwhelm your designs. So you have to be very careful with things like that. I've learned that quickly. I have a problem with naming all my games alliterative C words, so I'm working on Culinary Clash, and it's pretty early along, and I put that on the table. I didn't have any time to prepare for this, so all those videos you guys aren't getting, it's not because I'm spending all my time on this. I'm just swamped right now. But I didn't have any time to prepare for this, and I haven't worked on this game in 6 months, so I threw it on the table, just kind of said, okay, I'm going to make one rule change from last time to see if it helps any of the problems I'm having. It didn't. So the idea of Culinary Clash is it's a restaurant week type competition, and you're supposed to send guys out to the farmer's market to acquire meats, which you then cook and you place on a dial, and it takes time to cook, so every turn the dial turns, but all the meats take different times to cook. I want you to have to sync up your cooking and maneuver around other people so that you actually can make efficient use of actions. But what I ended up finding is that my resource acquisition methods are just not doing it, and my attempts to solve the problem, they are not working, and just makes me feel like I've got to just throw that resource acquisition mechanism.
Burn it down.
I'm going to keep it. I'm going to keep the core idea of it for a different game. A game where it makes more sense, and I don't want to get too much into it because I want to keep the idea. But get rid of that idea, and then I've got different ideas for that resource acquisition, although I still am trying to work through how to get the proper tension in this game about how to make it so that the resources are unique enough that you actually care what you have, while also still having it so that people can complete goals with some sort of tension there as well, without it being such that if somebody takes your goal, you're just completely screwed and can't make up for it. So it's still a design that's very early in progress, but even at that bit, there's some parts of the game that I know are good, and just getting it back out on the table and getting the feedback helps me see that there's just a couple parts that aren't going to work, and I'm going to have to take some chunks of it back to the drawing board. That's one of the levels of feedback you can be getting, and what you're looking for depends entirely on where you are in your design. If you're early in the design, that's the kind of thing. You might be just looking for, is this working at all, or should I just throw this away? If you're in the middle, like this game, you might be trying to see if a mechanic or a rule change are working, and then if you're late in the game, you're just looking to test some balance changes, but they're all valid things to do.
Which, if you've never been to one of these events, the prototypes that are brought to these events to playtest range all the way from, this is something I thought of last night and I wrote it on a bunch of cards, to I have a really solid game idea and I just need to figure out the balances and what powers work and what powers don't. So it's a whole range, and just even the professional quality goes from, I just wrote something in pen on a bunch of cardboard, all the way to, I went to the game crafter and I printed out a board with artwork and I have actual meeples and stuff. So
Yep, and if your level of game is, this goes on Kickstarter tomorrow, this is not actually the venue for you.
No, it's meant for more early in development games. One of the cool things about these events is the game crafter provides a bunch of free pieces. So they have they had these cool diamond shaped board game pieces and blank tiles and blank cards, and
apparently the gems came from someone else.
Oh, did they?
Yeah, I don't know where, but they came from somewhere else.
But they have blank cards, blank tiles, little cardboard chits, stuff like that for anyone can use and take and modify to their heart's content. So the next game we played was The Planets by S. Evan Walters. This was a abstract strategy game, which is not my genre at all. And it's a game about your little rocket ship, and there's this orbital movement because these planets are moving around this ring, and your ship can follow the gravity stream. And I was just I consider myself not a stupid person, but I was just really having trouble grasping the orbital gravity movement.
So yeah, to get into a little more detail, it's a hex play field, and it's got a bunch of hexes, and there's a sun in the center, and there's 6 orbitals around it. The play field is more hexes than there are orbitals. There's 10 hexes or so deep going outward, and there's 6 planets orbiting. and they all orbit differently. One of them orbits clockwise instead of counterclockwise, and one of them orbits super fast, so it makes 2 rotations at the time everything else takes 1. So you start from a planet and you're trying to send your diplomatic pods to all the other planets, or conversely get all the diplomatic pods onto your planet. And you can do this by riding planets or riding in their gravitational wells, or there's kind of a en passant type thing where the planet moves, but if you're in the planet's path when it moves, what happens is that you can choose to be picked up by the planet and then enter its gravitational field and get pulled to the next spot, or you can spend an action point to get off basically anywhere along its path. And it was a lot to hear the explanation. Once you actually understand it, I don't think it's as complicated as it seems up front. But so you're trying to pick up and deliver these tokens to all the planets, and the more you carry, the slower you go, because it's weighing your ship down. He had a provision in the game where you could actually go and take other people's flags off of planets, which was apparently just jamming the game up. We didn't play without that, and I think we ended the whole game in 7 turns.
Yeah, it was pretty quick.
It was pretty quick. But I definitely see how his other one would just basically stall the entire game out. But the 7 turns is pretty quick, and even with randomized planet positioning, I kind of feel like it's going to be something that there was basically no direct player interaction and very little indirect player interaction. Like if you dropped off your flag on someone else's home planet, you'd be helping them a little bit, but you couldn't really block them. You couldn't stop much. There's not a lot of interaction. I kind of feel like the game would end up being rather straightforward after a dozen plays under that circumstance.
I just couldn't wrap my head around the
movement?
The movement, yeah.
Yeah, well, there were some design issues to work out as well. He was trying to be intentionally vague with the orbits, and I do not think that's an approach that he should do.
But not to badmouth any, it's not my type of game in the first place, so I can't even really
I think for what
talk
it is,
about it.
I think for what it is, it was interesting. I just don't see it having a lot of longevity without having some actual direct player interaction, because you're basically racing against yourself at that point. And the other form of interaction bogged the game down too much.
Okay, anyway.
Now, I do want to say that his vision for the game was either a electronic or digital version where the planets actually followed their orbits in real time. Players were taking simultaneous moves, and the board game version where you take turns and all the planets move is a proof of concept to try to get the money to do the one where the planets automatically move. And I'll let you cover the last one.
Oh my gosh, the last one was also by Randy Eckel, and it was called Prime Location, and it's called Prime Location because the entire game is done in prime numbers, and I thought it was a blast. It was definitely a midweight game. It was basically sort of a set collection game. There was a deck of cards, and the cards were all prime numbers, and then there was a real estate themed board, area control board, and basically that was covered in much larger prime numbers, and the goal of the game was to collect prime number cards that added up to the numbers on the board, and once you had a meld with those numbers, you could take control of an area on the board. And for a game that's supposed to be a pun on prime numbers and real estate, it was just so much fun.
So there's a couple of other things that she left out here. In addition to the cards being prime numbers and the values you need to sum up to with the cards being prime numbers, the valid spaces on the point tracks are also prime numbers.
Yep.
So the number of points you could earn was quantized by spaces on the board. And there were also some bonuses for making large melds, and there were building a long chain of adjacent subregions, or there was each of the little regions was within a larger colored region, and getting one in each colored region would give you more points, also in a prime number thing. And apparently the other thing that was just added before our playtest that was a huge win was that I mentioned the points were quantized into prime numbers.
What he means by that is the score track went from like 7 to 9, and if you got 8 points, well, you didn't make it to 9, so you fell back to 7. And the change he made is whenever you fell back in points, you got one little makeup point that you could save for later, add to a different chunk of points, which might push you over into the next level.
This is less relevant at the bottom when you got 2, 3, 5, 7, and more relevant when you're trying to jump from, say, 53 to 59. And
I was stuck on, I think it was 31 to 37. I was stuck on that one for a while.
Yep. If you lost points, you got a chit which you could cash in later to move up an extra level, which made it not too bad to lose a couple. The one problem with the game as it was that the prime numbers on the board were low enough that some of the cards by the end of the game were just useless dead weight in your hand because they were larger than anything on the board, and you had to meld at least 3 cards.
Yeah, when there's just 17s and 13s left on the board, the 19 card suddenly becomes useless.
Ain't great.
But the great thing is I think that's a very fixable problem. There's definitely a couple of approaches you could take, and honestly, the beginning game and the mid game already felt like a published game. Like, it was just... I really like it. I would have bought it.
Yeah, for a game that was basically a one-trick pony, it was a pretty good trick. I'm just glad he didn't decide to make it so you had to multiply the cards together into a prime number rather than adding.
Yeah, I'd need a calculator at that point.
The calculator wouldn't help you make 2 factors into a prime.
Oh, duh, because... sorry.
That was our final game of the night, and we played those last 2 together because I was done testing, and we were just kind of running out the rest of the evening at that point.
The one other thing I wanted to mention is the ticket price includes refreshments, and they had cookies and brownies, and I ate way too many cookies and way too many brownies.
That's not necessarily a standard of every event labeled Protospiel.
No, I think the Madison one just had like some stale pretzels and a glass of water.
Well, this year, Protospiel Madison was going to have Hasbro Games sponsoring an increased beverage selection.
Oh, that'll be nice.
So we'll have to see about that one. And I can't vouch for any of the Unpub events either, because I've never been to those, but they are a similar idea in other areas that Protospiel doesn't cover. As a designer, I like digging into these things, but I also enjoy critiquing. I do like giving feedback, and that'll...
You like crushing people's dreams?
That depends entirely.
Which I will say is if you're going as a tester, it's okay to be brutal because people are coming here trying to find the flaws, and if you're too nice,
if you just say
they're not going to find the bugs.
If you say it's okay, you're not really helping anyone. That's kind of wasting the time. It's much better to hear this is terrible, even if you don't have a constructive this is what to do about it.
Yeah, as a non-designer, I can tell you what I don't like about a game and what doesn't work, but I'm not a designer, so I don't know necessarily how to fix it.
I'm happy to throw out off-the-wall ideas, although the other thing I like to keep in mind is I like to preface all my radical ideas with, I like Euro games. I don't tend to like heavy direct interaction games. I don't want to play war games. I don't want to play co-op games. Not really into real-time games or the dexterity games. That the fact that I found that other one interesting is a interesting exception. But I like to tell people that up front, and if they're still interested in my feedback, if they got a game outside of one of those genres, great. But I also like to remind you that what I want to see is not necessarily your design goals. So if I'm getting way off base from your design goals, whatever. Yeah. It's your game. You have to do what makes you happy.
Yep.
So I like...
Or at least what makes your future publisher happy.
Depends on whether you're doing it for publication or for fun, you know?
Yep. It's interesting because there's designers doing both. There's some that are there that are hoping to eventually find a publisher and get published, or even self-publish or do something like a Kickstarter. And there's people who are just there who just like designing as a hobby and just want to see where things go.
Protospiel Chicago, I don't think I really hit any egregious duds this time.
No.
The Protospiel Milwaukee this year, I didn't think it was a very good crop of games that I played. The quality can go up and down. I thought that everything I played this time, of all the games I played, mine was the worst. And I knew that because I didn't have time to prepare and didn't actually make any good changes. Everything else I played, I mean, besides the planets not being our thing, the other ones I played,
Yeah, it wasn't even bad. It just wasn't our thing.
They all had things to recommend them. I don't know, I'd say they were all great, but they all felt like viable ideas with a conclusion that could end up being a game that someone would like. If I go back to Protospiel Milwaukee, there was this one game, I won't mention what it was, there was one game that was just so terrible that I don't see any value ever coming out of it, and Jen will vouch for that.
Yeah, and sometimes it's okay to tell a designer, I don't think this game works on any level, because you don't want people chasing after something that doesn't work. Sinking time into something that's ultimately going to fail.
I've been trying for years now to come up with a way to do a auction game that is a simultaneous bidding, drafting, like Seven Wonders of Sushi Go, but with an auction. And everything I've tried has just crashed and burned miserably on the first playtest.
Oh my gosh, so bad, you guys. I've played a few of them because I'm sort of Jason's #1 playtester, and really bad.
But you gotta know that. You don't know it till you try.
Yeah.
And you look at it and it's like, okay, it doesn't work. Time to move on. Not really a big loss because I didn't put much effort into it at that point. Mm-hmm. And better to hear that than to spend 10 hours refining all the powers and all the other mechanics around it and find out that the core of your game, what's supposed to make it interesting, is unviable or unfun. Thanks for tuning in to Analysis Paralysis. We hope to have regular videos back up next month in October. Until then, happy gaming.